Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening? Seeking respite from the clamor of the world and finding solace in the echo of ancient times. Tonight we journey back, not merely through the passing centuries, but into the very heart of the Great Lake, Texcoco, where the fierce and resolute Mexica people, guided by prophecy, established their shining island city, Tenochtitlan, a marvel of ingenuity rising from the unstable marshlands, a testament to the power of human will intertwined with divine instruction. When they first arrived, the soil was treacherous and thin, a mere blanket of reeds floating atop deep, brackish water. The site that had been promised to them by their wandering gods, marked by the sacred eagle perched upon the nopal cactus, presented a cruel paradox, demanding they build a metropolis where stable land did not exist, where every foundation stone sank into the sucking mud. The elders, burdened by the realization that their new home lacked the vast, flat farming plains they had known in their ancestral lands, watched the waters of the lake with a growing despair, understanding that they could conquer neighboring tribes with their obsidian blades, but they could not fight the fundamental lack of earth required to feed a rising empire. Thus, the early years were fraught with hunger, a continuous anxiety that gnawed at the edges of their great ambition. The small patches of solid ground near the temple precinct could support little more than basic structures, and the canoes returning from the mainland bearing meager loads of maize could never sate the burgeoning population, which multiplied beneath the fierce sun of Huitzilopochtli. It was Elder Aslan, a man whose skin was weathered like dried clay, and whose eyes held the reflection of every dawn he had witnessed, who spent his days not in the council halls, but kneeling at the marsh's edge, observing the ceaseless cycles of decay and rebirth found within the aquatic grasses and the slow, heavy movement of the lake's currents. He watched how the dense mats of floating vegetation, comprised of interwoven reeds and discarded water hyacinth, caught the silt washed down from the surrounding mountains, slowly forming dense, semi-solid banks that, given enough time, became firm enough to support the weight of small wading birds, illustrating nature's own slow process of reclaiming the deep. Aztlan realized that the gods had not given them a punishment, but a complex puzzle, demanding not brute strength, but elegant cooperation. The earth they needed was not to be found, but to be manufactured, woven together through the very water that threatened to consume them, transforming the lake from an obstacle into the city's sustaining cradle. He gathered the younger builders, men known for their strong arms and their patience, and instructed them to take the long, slender poles of ahujote willow and drive them deep into the soft lake bottom, establishing submerged boundaries that defined the first sacred rectangles of what would eventually be known across the valley as the Chinampas, the floating gardens, or the woven reed islands. These first stakes were the skeleton of the new land, anchoring the plots firmly to the underwater foundation, ensuring that though the water might rise and fall with the seasons, the fertile structure itself remained steadfast, resisting the gentle pull of the currents and the disruptive wake of the passing canoes that ferried goods across the city's network of canals. Once the willow stakes were set, forming large, rectilinear cages, typically the width of a man's outstretched arms, the laborious process of gathering the raw materials began. Hundreds of canoes were dispatched to the lake's shallowest zones, their crews equipped with wide baskets and long-handled scoops designed to dredge the thick, black, nutrient-rich muck from the bottom of the surrounding canal. This lake mud, saturated with the decay of fish and aquatic plants, possessed an unparalleled richness, a dense silt that was essentially pure natural fertilizer, and it was piled high onto the woven reed platforms that had been carefully placed between the guiding willow poles, layer upon layer, until the surface rose well above the level of the surrounding lake water. It was a monumental task, demanding a constant, rhythmic effort. The driving of the wood, the weaving of the reeds, the silent, back-breaking dredging of the heavy, pungent soil. Yet there was a profound spiritual resonance to the work, as every shovelful of mud pulled from the depths represented a conscious, magical act of creation, literally bringing earth into existence where only water had been before. To maintain the structural integrity and prevent the precious soil from washing back into the lake, the edges of these new islands were reinforced, not with stone, but with a living barrier, achieved by planting more willow cuttings, the roots of which would swiftly grow downwards, binding the rich mud core together and interlocking with the underlying reeds, creating a stable, permeable retaining wall. These willow trees, known for their rapid growth and deep thirst, served a dual purpose. They secured the precious Chinampa plots physically, and they provided much-needed shade, protecting the delicate seedlings from the intense tropical sun during the high heat of the midday, ensuring that the moisture drawn up from the underlying lake remained trapped within the fertile topsoil. The finished Chinampa plot, typically long and narrow to maximize the available edge space that benefited from constant subterranean irrigation, was a masterpiece of sustainable engineering. It required no cumbersome systems of irrigation ditches or water diversion, as the roots of the crops were eternally nourished by the very lake that surrounded them, drawing moisture through capillary action. Within weeks of their construction, these meticulously layered mud plots were transformed from dark rectangles of raw earth into vibrant blankets of green. Maize, chilies, beans, squash, and the brilliant amaranth sprouted in rapid succession, often allowing the farmers to achieve 3 or 4 successful harvests in a single year, a yield unmatched by any conventional farming practiced on the drier mainland. This miraculous bounty was seen not merely as an agricultural triumph, but as a blessing from Tlaloc, the rain deity, and Chalchiotlique, the goddess of standing water, symbolizing the god's acceptance of the Mexica's audacious attempt to civilize and utilize the sacred, unpredictable forces of the lake itself. The canals running between the Chinampas were thus not merely transportation routes, but arteries of life, teeming with fish and used for constant replenishment. The farmers would routinely scoop fresh mud from the canals back onto the raised beds, ensuring a perpetual fertility that never diminished, thus eliminating the need for long fallow periods that starved mainland communities. Tenochtitlan thus became the city of perpetual harvest, a magnificent aquatic metropolis where the urban and the agrarian were inextricably linked, where every house was within rowing distance of a source of fresh food, and where the air was always thick with the scent of damp earth and ripening crops, contrasting sharply with the dry, dusty air of rival settlements. The visual spectacle was breathtaking. Thousands upon thousands of these meticulously ordered gardens, stretching away into the hazy distance, interrupted only by the narrow, weaving pathways of the canals, where small, swift canoes carrying baskets of peppers and squash navigated silently towards the great central markets of Tlatelolco. To walk along the edge of a Chinampa was to experience a profound sense of peace and stability, knowing that this land, built painstakingly by the hands of the ancestors, was the very foundation of their power and permanence, granting them the independence and security that allowed their empire to flourish far beyond the expectations of their skeptical neighbors. The maintenance of the Chinampas required constant vigilance and a deep, ingrained rhythm, a collaborative dance between the farmer and the fluid earth. Every family was responsible for their stretch of canal, ensuring the water flow was not choked by excess vegetation and that the banks of the plots remained strong against erosion, cementing the idea that community well-being was tied directly to the health of the fertile plots. Children learned from their earliest years to distinguish the perfect density of silt, to drive the willow stakes with precision, and to respect the water which gave them everything, understanding that this mastery over the lake was a sacred trust, a continuous act of honoring the place where the eagle had finally landed. The gardens were not just fields. They were sacred geometry, perfect rectangles carved into the chaotic expanse of nature, symbolizing the Mexica belief in order and structure imposed upon the primordial waters of creation, a microcosm of their entire cosmological view. Even the structure of their homes reflected this dependency on the aquatic environment. Reed mats and light construction materials were favored initially, ensuring that the structures did not impose too great a weight upon the softer ground. And many homes had small, personal Chinampa plots tethered directly outside their doors, allowing immediate access to fresh herbs and vegetables. As the city grew and the central temple districts became fortified with heavy stone, the surrounding Chinampas ensured that the core population remained resilient against siege, transforming the lake, which would normally serve as a vulnerability, into the most formidable protective moat imaginable, securing their food supply internally. The success of the Chinampas allowed the Mexica society to specialize. With an abundance of food secured by the tireless work of the farmers, priests could dedicate themselves fully to the study of the heavens. Warriors could train ceaselessly for expansion, and artisans could perfect the crafts that made Tenochtitlan the most beautiful city in the New World. Elder Aslan lived long enough to see the reeds and mud he first manipulated grow into the backbone of a vast empire, and he taught his descendants that true strength was not found in how much earth you conquered, but in how deeply you understood and collaborated with the natural forces that governed life. He used to tell the young builders that every basket of mud they laid upon the floating platform was a prayer whispered to the earth, a promise of cultivation and respect, reminding them that they were not merely farmers, but true creators, coaxing stability from the most unstable of environments. The subtle sound of the water lapping against the willow root boundaries became the city's ceaseless lullaby, a sound that permeated the dreams of its inhabitants and anchored their spirits to the unique, fabricated reality they had brought forth from the heart of the great, shimmering lake. Now, as the sun begins its slow descent beyond the jagged peaks that frame the valley, let us hold the image of those endless green rectangles in our minds, those gardens that truly floated, that sustained the hungry gods and the ambitious people of the city of the cactus stone, a floating empire built on the quiet strength of mud and woven reed. Sleep now, dear listeners, and may your own dreams be as fertile and as well anchored as the ancient Chinampas Tenochtitlán, finding peace in the rhythm of water and earth, knowing that even in the most challenging terrain, genius and reverence can yield the most magnificent harvest. May your spirit drift lightly upon the tranquil currents, and may the wisdom of the old builders guard your rest throughout the night. The city, however, never truly slept, even if its inhabitants dreamt deeply. The pulse of the Chinampas demanded ceaseless vigilance against the liquid world that cradled them. Just as the morning mist began to dissolve over the obsidian slopes, revealing the twin volcanoes Iztaccíhuatl and Popocatépetl, the first canoes were already slicing through the mirror-like canals, carrying the rich, fertile silt dug from the deeper lake bed. This mud, black and heavy with the decomposition of countless generations of aquatic life, was the true gold of Tenochtitlan, the vital nutrient that prevented the floating rafts from becoming mere stagnant swamps. Without this constant replenishment, the genius of the engineers would fail, and the delicate balance between water and cultivated earth would quickly collapse back into the surrounding marsh. Among those who mastered this essential craft was an old man named Citlali, whose hands were gnarled and perpetually stained with the deep blue pigment of the indigo plants he cultivated near the central causeway, marking him as a man intimately familiar with the demands of the dye masters. Citlali had spent 80 seasons studying the exact chemistry of the lake's silt, discerning which layers held the most nitrogen for the fast-growing maize and which were best suited for the delicate flowers used in ritual offerings to Huitzilopochtli. He understood that the success of the island was predicated on a perpetual cycle of giving and receiving, where what was taken from the lake in one season had to be carefully replaced, refined, and recirculated in the next, maintaining the perfect depth for root stability. He moved with a quiet authority that required no loud words, his very presence on the shallow draft canoe signaling the seriousness of the morning's endeavor as he navigated the narrow waterways toward the newest sections of the expanding farm system. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply communal, requiring teams of workers to scoop the mud into woven baskets with long-handled scoops, hoisting the heavy loads onto the waiting platforms where others stood ready to receive the precious cargo. Each new layer of mud was not merely dumped, but carefully spread and integrated into the existing soil, ensuring the willow roots below were not disturbed, and the surface remained perfectly level for the precise irrigation channeled from the small, interconnected trenches. The rhythm of their movements created a natural chorus, the metallic scraping sound of the wooden scoops against the lake bottom, the grunts of communal effort as the baskets were raised, and the gentle splash as the empty containers were dipped back into the cool water for the next load. This perpetual building was not just maintenance. It was a slow, deliberate act of expanding the city's living territory, securing a future harvest year by patient year, a testament to unwavering human perseverance. The people of the mainland often looked upon the Chinampas with a mixture of awe and profound skepticism, unable to reconcile the notion of permanent settlement upon foundations that seemingly yielded to every passing current. Yet, the farmers of Tenochtitlan knew a stability deeper than hard, unmoving stone. They relied instead on adaptation and fluidity, trusting the pliability of the dense willow roots more than the unyielding rigidity of granite blocks. Their stability was not founded upon resistance to change, but rather the constant, practiced response to the lake's inevitable tides and seasonal swells, a philosophy of yielding that paradoxically ensured survival and longevity for their floating world. The masters of the Chinampas taught that true strength was not about refusing to move, but about knowing how to sway without breaking, much like the reeds that lined the borders of their meticulously maintained water fields. One of the greatest dangers, hidden beneath the beauty of the emerald gardens and the calm surface of the water, was the insidious intrusion of the brackish, salty waters from the vast eastern Lake Texcoco, which would instantly poison the crops and shatter the delicate ecosystem of the freshwater canals upon which all life depended. To counteract this silent and persistent enemy, a massive stone and earth dike, built under the shrewd guidance of the great ruler Nezahualcóyotl, stood as a silent, submerged wall many leagues in length, separating the life-giving sweet water of Xochimilco and Chalco from the destructive brine. This monumental feat of hydrological engineering required constant supervision, its structural integrity checked daily by specialized hydrological priests who read the water levels like sacred texts, gauging the equilibrium between the two opposing aqueous worlds. These priests, often dressed in simple white robes, signifying the purity required for their vital task, carefully calibrated reed measures and small, polished obsidian mirrors to observe the sun's reflection on the water's surface, seeking minute variations in the current or the slightest change in the water's chemical taste. They understood that the continued prosperity of the entire capital hinged upon their quiet, often unseen calculations, recognizing that a failed floodgate or a breach in the Great Wall could wipe out a season's sustenance and contaminate the drinking water within mere hours of neglect. Their work was therefore the true unseen governance of the city, ensuring the physical foundation remained sound beneath the bustling markets, shining pyramidal temples, and the residential districts, protecting the very breath of the Mexica people. Within the rectangular confines of the Chinampas, life flourished in magnificent density, a veritable tapestry of nourishment woven closely together by the farmers' practiced hands and deep knowledge of intercropping methods. The tall stalks of maize rose first, reaching skyward like supplicants offering bounty to the sun. Their strong roots plunged deep into the rich, dark mud, providing essential shade for the lower-growing, sensitive plants. Beneath the canopy of the maze, climbing beans wound their way up the sturdy stalks, fixing precious nitrogen back into the soil, while squash vines spread their wide, protective leaves across the ground, conserving the precious moisture stored within the cultivated island's core. This harmonious and efficient triple cropping system ensured maximum output from every single square measure of land, a testament to agricultural wisdom refined over centuries of careful observation and collaborative effort with the spirit of the earth. As the day progressed and the sun climbed to its zenith, casting sharp shadows down the narrow water lanes, the air became thick with the scent of wet earth, blooming flowers, and the fermenting richness of the compost heaps maintained at the corner of every plot. These compost piles were the unsung heroes of the Chinampa system, containing meticulously layered organic waste, ash, and human night soil, transforming decay back into explosive fertility. The maintenance of the compost required careful attention, ensuring the heat of decomposition did not become too great, transforming waste into usable, light soil amendment that was far easier to transport and integrate than the heavy river silt. It was understood that nothing could be wasted in this constrained environment. Every fragment of life returned to feed the living. The children of the Chinampa farmers grew up intimately aware of the life cycle, their earliest memories filled with the sounds of water and the feeling of rich mud squeezing between their toes as they learned to swim and navigate the intricate network of canals in tiny dugout boats. They were taught not to fear the water, but to respect its immense power, learning to mend the willow fences with supple precision and to identify the subtle shift in the water's color that signaled changes in depth or potential contamination. These lessons were not taught from scrolls or stone tablets, but passed down through the physical repetition of daily tasks, ensuring that the critical knowledge of floating agriculture was woven into the very muscle memory of the next generation. They were the inheritors of the lake's great secret. When the crops ripened in their magnificent abundance, the tranquil canals transformed almost instantly into bustling arteries of commerce, choked with narrow, flat-bottomed canoes laden impossibly high with fresh produce, vibrant red chilies, huge bundles of purple amaranth, green tomatoes known as tomatillos, and the heavy, bulbous gourds. These vessels moved swiftly and silently, propelled by strong arms and long poles that nudged against the canal banks, converging upon the massive market of Tlatelolco, located just north of the Great Temple Precinct. The bounty from the floating gardens fed hundreds of thousands of souls daily, making the city a beacon of sustenance unmatched in the ancient world, able to sustain its vast population without reliance on long, fragile supply lines. The sheer scale of the operation required sophisticated logistical planning. The supervisors maintained detailed knotted string records, the Kipu system borrowed and adapted, tracking not only yields but also the exact volume of silt added to each section of the farm annually. These records helped predict areas of erosion or depletion, ensuring that the constant process of dredging and replenishment remained perfectly aligned with the demands of the city's population and the seasonal shifts of the lake itself. The organization of the Chinampas was a silent masterpiece of ancient administration, a model of agricultural efficiency that supported the complex hierarchy of the empire. For the Mexica people, the Chinampa was far more than an engineering feat. It was a physical manifestation of their cosmological view, a miniature, stable world, the Tlaticpac, Surrounded by the unending, watery chaos, the Ott, perpetually struggling against the entropic forces of dissolution. Each successful harvest was viewed not just as an economic success, but as a profound victory over disorder, secured through the sacred pact maintained constantly between the priests, the diligent farmers, and the powerful water deities, most importantly, Tlaloc, the life-giving rain-giver. Therefore, every planting cycle began and ended with elaborate, heartfelt rituals of sacrifice and thanks, ensuring the continued favor of the forces that allowed Earth to float precariously upon the water. As the day waned and the market activity began to subside, the farmers would often perform the crucial task of irrigating the fields one last time, gently releasing water from the narrow channels into the thirsty mud, ensuring the soil remained perfectly saturated. This was a meditative moment, the sound of the flowing water a soothing counterpoint to the day's hard labor, a time for reflection on the profound connection between their effort and the abundance that flowed from the dark soil. They knew that Tenochtitlán was not merely a city of stone temples and military might. It was fundamentally a city of mud and water, built and sustained by the delicate balance they strove daily to maintain. The elder Citlali, pulling his canoe slowly home along the main channel, would often pause to admire the reflections of the great Templo Mayor shimmering on the water's surface, noticing how the massive temple seemed to rise directly from the heart of the fertile fields they cultivated. He understood that the gold of the temple was bought with the mud of the Chinampas. The splendor of the priests and the warriors rested upon the constant, muddy labor of the farmers. The floating gardens were the true, silent foundation of the empire, the unending, green promise of tomorrow's meal, secured just beneath the thin veil of the evening mist. And so, the work continued without pause, sunrise blending into midday heat, the rhythm of the builders and the silent glide of the canoes forming the enduring, powerful heartbeat of the floating city, a sound that only the inhabitants of the Great Lake truly understood. Though the Chinampas appeared static, unchanging rectangles of green when viewed from the city walls, they were in truth dynamic, living ecosystems, requiring the constant, educated intervention of human hands to maintain their miraculous existence above the profound, dark depths of the eternal lake. The whispers of the old builders, those forgotten architects who first devised the basket and the mud, echoed still in the tireless labor of their descendants, reminding them always of the magnificent fragility upon which their entire civilization rested, floating on the generosity of the water itself. The dawn upon the Great Lake was not heralded by harsh light, but by a heavy, pearl-gray mist that rose slowly from the cool water, clinging close to the earth and dampening the woven reed walls of the farmers' huts built along the primary causeways. This profound silence of the early hours was broken only by the soft, rhythmic lapping of the water against the deeply woven edges of the Chinampas and the distant call of water birds wading through the shallows, searching patiently for crustaceans hidden among the submerged roots of the ancient cypress trees. This dense blanket of moisture was essential, a palpable blessing from the Lake Mother, keeping the dark, fertile soil cool and mitigating the intensity of the midday sun that would soon bear down upon the exposed, meticulously tended fields with tropical severity. The farmer, named Coscacuatli, waking to this familiar dampness, would reach immediately for his koa, the simple yet perfectly engineered digging stick tipped with fire-hardened wood, knowing that the soil was now at its most yielding state, heavy with nighttime dew. He would push his slender canoe out into the narrow waterway, the surface slick and dark beneath his paddle, preparing to collect the new layer of nutrient-rich silt that had settled overnight, an essential, renewable resource known only to the cultivators of the lake gardens. This rich, black substance, smelling heavily of decaying reeds and the profound deep earth, was then carefully layered upon the garden plots, thickening the base and perpetually renewing the astonishing fertility that allowed 3 or even 4 substantial harvests each year from the very same small rectangle of reclaimed ground. Planting was done not by guesswork or sudden impulse, but by precise, inherited knowledge, the farmer knowing exactly how many seeds of maize or chili could thrive within a single Chinampa border without exhausting the soil's finite bounty, ensuring a maximized yield while respecting the land's limits. Tiny squares of germinated seedlings started weeks earlier in small, interwoven baskets and carefully nurtured were transplanted with delicate, swift movements into the prepared beds, anchoring the soil structure and sending down fine white root systems into the permanent, subterranean moisture. These young shoots, carefully placed in rows that maximized sun exposure throughout the day, were the physical embodiment of the silent contract between the people of the sun and the gods of the water and the earth, a palpable offering of faith, skill, and disciplined labor. The narrow waterways separating the gardens were not merely convenient paths for the transport of canoes, but were critical, living arteries for the entire system, allowing the essential capillary action that drew moisture steadily up into the elevated beds, keeping the soil perfectly hydrated, never flooded, and never allowed to dry out. These channels, meticulously maintained and constantly cleared of excessive aquatic growth, served as silent highways for the commerce of the lake, moving baskets of ripening tomatoes and pungent chilies toward the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, connecting the fields directly to the very heart of urban consumption. The water itself held the story of the Chinampa, reflecting the deep green of the burgeoning crops, the quick movements of the native fish, and the slow, graceful drift of the cultivated algae, all interwoven into a single, complex tapestry of productivity and sustainable life. Yet, for all the precision and highly technical skill involved in the construction and maintenance, the farmer knew that the true abundance did not spring solely from his own efforts, but derived from the delicate temperament of Tlaloc, the ancient, powerful deity whose tears brought both the nourishing, life-giving rain and the destructive, swift floods that could drown the entire lake basin in a single devastating season. Before the great planting seasons arrived, specific rites were often conducted not within the grand public temples of the city, but quietly beside the water's edge, where small, smooth stones and bundles of sacred herbs were humbly offered to the surface of the channel, gently sinking beneath the dark water. These sincere, humble devotions ensured the calm spirit of the water and secured the unspoken promise that the currents would remain gentle and that the rains would arrive with measured, beneficial intensity, never turning the deep, ancient lake into a furious, consuming giant. As the sun climbed higher toward the zenith, burning away the last persistent wisps of morning fog, the activity shifted diligently from the preparatory planting to the continuous, immediate cycle of harvesting the mature plots, where rows of tall maize stood like magnificent columns supporting the very sky above the lake. The farmer's wife and his older children would join the vital work, their nimble fingers expertly selecting the reddest, firmest produce, the heavy squash and climbing beans that grew intermingled beneath the shade of the corn stalks, maximizing every precious inch of cultivated ground. This polyculture approach, where multiple species supported each other's growth and nutrient needs, was the ultimate wisdom of the original Chinampa architect, ensuring necessary biodiversity and profound resilience against blight, serving as a living metaphor for the structured complexity of the entire Aztec world. The sounds emanating from the Chinampas during the late morning were markedly different from the distant roar and clamor of Tenochtitlan's great stone avenues. Here, the prevailing sound was one of measured, organic labor, the soft, repetitive thunk of the koa breaking the damp soil, the gentle rush of water as a canoe was pushed forward, and the rhythmic, low-pitched singing of the collective workers. This communal singing was not for merriment alone, but served a deeply practical purpose, coordinating the precise movements of many hands across the neighboring plots, ensuring that the work pace remained steady and aligned across the vast interwoven network of gardens stretching toward the horizon. Even the youngest children, performing the essential task of chasing away the persistent, hungry water birds that sought to steal the seeds, added their sharp calls and rhythmic clops to the enduring, slow symphony of cultivation that defined the rhythm of life on the lake. The most arduous and crucial labor of the entire cycle involved the periodic dredging of the narrow channels every few lunar cycles, a task that demanded immense physical strength and unending patience, executed with long-handled scoops made of finely netted reeds stretched taut over a wooden frame. This retrieved sludge, thick with centuries of decomposing plant life and the settled organic matter of the lake bottom, was the true silent gold of the empire, the necessary, constant compost that elevated the garden beds and kept them perpetually young and unbelievably fertile. Without this constant replenishing of the deep black mud, the beds would slowly compact, compress, and eventually sink back into the underlying saline water, returning to the swampy depths from which they were so miraculously raised by the ingenuity and ceaseless effort of the Tlatoani's ancient engineer. Within the sprawling, vast expanse of the Chinampas, life followed a defined and ancient social structure, deeply rooted in the Kalpuli, or neighborhood clan, where the land rights were held collectively and managed communally, ensuring that no single family could neglect their duties and thereby endanger the critical food supply of the whole community. Disputes over water rights, though rendered rare due to the established and strictly controlled canal system, were mediated instantly by the revered elders of the Kalpuli, who understood implicitly that the harmony of the entire system depended utterly upon the cooperative balance between the demands of the individual farmer and the overarching, profound needs of the bustling metropolis. Therefore, every single ear of corn grown in these floating rectangles was, in a profound sense, a direct tribute to the necessary cohesion and disciplined governance that held the great island city firm above the shifting, unstable waters. As the sun began its inevitable descent toward the high western mountains, casting long, dramatic ochre shadows across the lake's surface, the pace of human labor slowed, transitioning slowly into the final, vital task of the day, irrigation, where small channels were opened just enough to allow the water to seep gently into the lower earth, refreshing the soil without perilously saturating the plant roots. The heavy tools were carefully cleaned and stored, tucked securely beneath the thatch roofs, ready for the immediate return to labor at the first hint of morning light, symbolizing the unending, necessary vigilance required to maintain the artificial lands in their state of miraculous fertility. The air grew perceptibly cooler, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damped, disturbed soil and the distant, smoky aroma of cooking fires beginning to ignite within the surrounding homes built along the stable land borders of the district. Resting finally upon the porch of his sturdy reed house, the farmer, Cozcacuatli, would look out over the channels, watching the smooth, reflective darkness of the water, contemplating the profound, unseen depth beneath the thin, laboriously constructed layer of soil he stood upon. He knew with absolute certainty that the life they sustained was a constant, deliberate act of defiance against the lake's natural inclination to reclaim its domain, a complex negotiation carried out daily with mud and muscle, proving the dominance of human will and intricate engineering over the untamed wilderness. This reflection was not born of fear, but of deep, abiding respect, acknowledging that the lake, while held at bay by human effort, was also the ultimate provider, offering the very platform and the essential nourishment upon which the entire vibrant world of Tenochtitlan was constructed and continuously survived. Once the twilight deepened fully into true night, a completely different soundscape enveloped the Chinampas, replacing the human voices and the sounds of tools with the rhythmic, deep-throated croaking of thousands of frogs and the subtle, sharp movements of nocturnal creatures hunting along the dark water's edge. The flickering, distant lights from the main city, torches illuminating the great stone pyramids against the dark sky, provided a ghostly, impressive backdrop, a stark reminder that the luxurious feasts and political maneuverings within the capital were wholly sustained by the tranquil, often forgotten labor happening silently far out on the black, fertile fields. The stars above, brilliant and close in the clear mountain air, seemed to directly mirror the structured plots below. Both the cosmos and the crops laid out in perfect, eternal, cultivated rectangles of order. Even in the profound, cold darkness, the silent, essential work of fertility continued beneath the surface. The slow, natural decomposition of organic matter beneath the layers of mud, creating the necessary heat and the nutrients required for the rapid growth that defined the garden's astonishing productivity, turning simple waste into immediate, consumable wealth. The water cycle, moving unseen through the porous earth and the intricate capillary channels, ensured that even during the brief, predictable dry periods, the delicate roots of the plants never suffered thirst, a testament to the sophisticated understanding of hydrology possessed by the ancient builders of the lake city generations ago. It was this unbroken, subterranean promise of moisture and decomposition that guaranteed the continuous, incredible yield, defying the seasonal limitations known by those who farmed the dry, stony earth of the mainland valleys, who waited anxiously for the coming rains. The knowledge required to successfully manage the complexity of the Chinampas was sacred and entirely hereditary, passed down not through written codices or scholarly scrolls, but through the calloused hands and ingrained instinct of successive generations, ensuring that the necessary practices remained perfectly preserved and constantly adapted to the lake's subtle, shifting moods. Every child raised amongst the floating plots learned instinctively the difference between the salinity levels in the deep, central waters and the fresh water diverted from the distant springs of Chapultepec, understanding implicitly how the careful balance of sweet and salt governed the successful growth of the delicate food crops. They were raised with the solemn understanding that they were not merely simple farmers, but were the vigilant guardians of a fragile, miraculous undertaking, the essential protectors of the very ground beneath the city's majestic, high-reaching temples. Consider the meticulous cultivation of the chili pepper, a staple spice and vital medicinal necessity, whose small, sensitive plants required meticulous protection from the cold lake winds and the pervasive early morning chill, often sheltered beneath temporary reed covers woven by the women. These vibrant, potent fruits, growing in fiery patches of red and green across the dark, wet earth, symbolize the spirited energy and profound resilience of the people themselves, thriving so abundantly in an environment defined by constant physical challenge and adaptation. The harvest of the chiles was often a cause for community celebration, marking a successful phase of the growing cycle and providing essential ingredients for the rich, complex sauces consumed daily in every corner and household of the vast, demanding capital. Yet, the greatest, most constant enemy of the floating gardens remained the insidious, creeping advance of the deeper, naturally saline waters of the southern lake basin, which, if not carefully and continuously managed by the massive dike systems, would swiftly poison the freshwater plots and render them utterly sterile. The great dike of Nezahualcoyotl, stretching formidably across the lake, was therefore seen not only as a feat of defensive engineering protecting the city from floods, but as a holy barrier, constantly safeguarding the fertility of the northern half from the corrosive, destructive embrace of the south, a silent, monumental promise of ongoing life. The farmers lived in constant awareness of the water levels, their eyes trained to spot the subtle changes in color and movement that signaled potential breaches or hidden dangers lurking beneath the seemingly calm, uniform surface of the water. Coscacuautli would finally retire after the stars were high, his muscles heavy and weary from the weight of the rich, wet soil and the endless bending over the rows, his mind already calculating the precise planting rotation for the coming week, ensuring the land was never left idle, always yielding its utmost bounty. The canoe, tethered securely beside the reed platform, rocked gently in the small, vanishing wake of a passing messenger, the only movement upon the vast, dark, cultivated plain of water that stretched silently toward the distant, sleeping pyramids of the empire. This constant, vigilant labor, performed in the silent, hidden fields of the lake, was the profound, unending prayer whispered daily to the gods, the true sustenance that upheld the whole of the mighty Aztec world. The air just before the dawn broke was cold and smelled sharply of wet reeds, and wood smoke carried faintly from the great city, a familiar scent Coscacuautli knew better than his own breath. He rose from his rush mat before the sun, careful not to disturb his sleeping wife, Siwaton, and immediately began the arduous task of separating the first perfect ears of maize and gathering the dew-kissed leaves of amaranth and the tight green crowns of squash. The silent work demanded absolute concentration, for only the finest produce, unblemished and vibrant in color, would satisfy the discerning eyes of the priests and merchants waiting in the bustling market square of Tlatelolco. He moved with the quiet reverence of a devotee performing a sacred rite, knowing that the quality of his harvest was a direct reflection of his own spiritual diligence and respect for the earth goddess Tonantzin, who demanded constant tribute. The Akali canoe was loaded precisely. The heavy clay pots of chiles balanced against the intricately woven baskets of large, water-fed tomatoes, ensuring perfect stability for the long, silent glide through the narrow, water-lily-choked channels. He pushed off the Chinampas' edge, the long poling stick sinking into the thick, yielding sediment below, feeling the deep firmness of the tightly woven willow and cypress roots that formed the island's core, a living raft of immense and silent strength. As he navigated the dark waterway, Quetzalcoatl instinctively checked the submerged supporting posts, ancient logs driven deep into the lakebed, which anchored his fragile plot against the strong, unpredictable winds that occasionally swept down from the western mountains, the tepet that ringed the valley. This dense network of submerged timber, bundled reeds, and woven matting was the true, hidden architecture of his prosperity, requiring constant, unseen vigilance against the slow, insidious decay of perpetual immersion. He paused his poling stroke to inspect the edge where the fresh canal water met the rich, black soil, confirming that the precious sediment, the dark tzlazali, dredged meticulously from the adjacent canal bottom, was sufficiently banked to prevent valuable nutrients from washing back into the current. This thick, fetid mud, perpetually layered with decomposing reeds, fish waste, and the accumulated remnants of the surrounding farms, was the true gold of the valley, endlessly replenishing the Chinampa soil and allowing for 3 or even 4 spectacular harvests each year without exhausting the land's power. He exchanged slow, silent nods with Xochipilli, a neighboring farmer already poling his delicate cargo of marigolds and jasmine toward the Great Causeway, a shared acknowledgement of the profound dedication required before the true rising of the sun god Huitzilopochtli. The community of the water farmers was bound not by lineage alone, but by the necessity of shared defense against the unpredictable lake, collaborating swiftly to clear invasive debris and maintain the critical, unobstructed flow of the life-giving, clean water through the arterial channels. As the sky brightened to the color of pale jade, the rhythmic sound of his poling stick pushing against the soft, cool mud became part of the lake's rising song, a counterpoint to the distant cries of gulls and the chirping of the waking reed birds. The path he followed was not a direct route, but a meandering course, dictated by the complex system of ownership and irrigation trenches, each curve revealing another meticulously tended rectangle of green abundance stretching away into the vast distance. He moved through the world of the Chinampa as a shepherd moves among his flock, recognizing the slight differences in the density of the growth, knowing precisely which patch of beans was ready for plucking and which row of chilies still needed the protection of a light layer of protective mulch. This careful management ensured a steady, predictable supply to the city every single day, preventing the cycles of famine that plagued the agricultural lands beyond the protection of the Great Lake. The proximity to the Great Dike now became obvious, its massive, stone-reinforced bank rising several man-heights above the water, appearing as a dark, unyielding mountain chain drawn across the flat, liquid horizon. It was here, at the gates, that the greatest tension resided, where the subtle hydrostatic pressures of the northern basin met the heavy, saline weight of the south, a monumental contest of fresh life against destructive salt. Quetzalcoatl briefly recalled the stories of the terrible flood years before the Great Wall was completed by the ingenuity of Nezahualcóyotl, times when the lake rose up in anger and the precious gardens were swallowed entirely by the deep water, turning fertile fields into barren, brackish pools. He felt a moment of deep gratitude for the engineers and the vast manpower that had raised this protective shield, acknowledging the enormous, unspoken debt that every farmer and citizen of the valley owed to this monumental labor of stones and earth. He steered his vessel toward one of the managed channels piercing the dike, where a guard stood overseeing the intricate system of sluice gates made of massive timber and tightly woven mats, regulating the passage of vessels and the precise flow of the water. The guard, a muscular man whose duty was heavier than any soldier's, recognized Cazcaquatli and gave a curt nod, lifting the counterweight that slowly allowed the heavy timber gate to rise just enough for the passage of a single, laden canoe. Passing beneath the gate felt like moving through a solemn, sacred threshold, leaving the intimate quietude of the deep Chinampa fields for the demanding, commercial arteries that led directly into the pulsing, obsidian heart of the empire. Once through, the water felt different, heavier and slightly faster flowing, reflecting the accumulated traffic and the broader engineering of the central city's transit canals. The aroma of Tenochtitlán now intensified, mingling the clean, earthy smells of the Chinampas with the pungent steam of cooking maize, the sweet smoke of copal incense rising from the temple precincts, and the sharper, metallic scent of fish recently landed at the main docks. The banks of the canals began to change, no longer soft, yielding mud, but replaced by meticulously fitted blocks of volcanic rock, worn smooth by centuries of canoes scraping past and the endless washing of the lake water. He could see the imposing, stepped sides of the massive Templo Mayor now, its dual shrines painted starkly in red and blue, dominating the eastern sky and serving as a silent, powerful reminder of the destination of his labor and the divine purpose of the city. Every ear of corn he carried, every chili pepper, was ultimately destined to feed the enormous populace that built and defended those pyramids, sustaining the priests whose rituals maintained the very motion of the sun. In the wider, deep channels leading to Tlatelolco, Cazcaquatli found himself suddenly amidst a thick procession of other vendors, their canoes heavy with flowers, baskets, firewood, and exotic plumes brought from the distant coastal regions. Here, the competition began in earnest, a quiet but fierce contest for the most advantageous position at the market docks and the best prices for the day's freshest yield. He kept his paddle strokes steady and strong, refusing to be drawn into the minor scuffles or hurried maneuvers that often characterized the approach to the market, preferring to trust in the superior quality of his carefully cultivated produce. He understood that haste bred mistakes, and a damaged tomato or a bruised squash represented not only lost value, but a slight against the perfection demanded by the gods. He observed a group of young men dredging a nearby canal segment, using long, woven nets on poles to lift the rich, black sediment from the bottom and deposit it onto waiting barges, laboring under the direction of an overseer from the city's engineering guild. This was the cyclic renewal of the whole system, the continuous process that ensured the canals remained deep enough for navigation, while simultaneously producing the tlazoli necessary to maintain the fertility of the surrounding gardens. The city and the Chinampas were bound together in this watery symbiosis. The city generated the enriched soil, and the soil generated the food that sustained the city's vast appetite. Coscacuautli secured his canoe at the designated farming dock, quickly laying out his wares on a reed mat beside the stone path, separating the perfect husks of maize meant for the central distribution houses from the smaller squash intended for direct market sale to individual citizens. He watched the first merchants approach, their keen eyes immediately assessing the color, size, and firmness of the produce, their hands expert at judging weight and quality without uttering a single unnecessary word. He knew he must stand firm on his price, reflecting the honest weight of his labor and the spiritual commitment invested in every inch of the rich, black soil that clung faintly to the roots of his plants. He remembered a story told by his grandfather, a tale of a time when a great drought had afflicted the valley, and the water levels dropped so low that the lake floor was exposed, turning the normally hidden, deep sediments into dry, cracked earth. During that desperate season, even the mighty dike seemed to fail its purpose, as the air itself became hot and stagnant, and the usual cool moisture of the Chinampas evaporated into a dry haze, threatening to destroy years of careful labor. The grandfather described how the farmers did not panic, but instead dedicated themselves to carrying water by hand in clay pots from the deepest remaining sections of the main channel, a ceaseless, exhausting effort to save the rooted crops inch by agonizing inch, honoring their sacred promise to the land. This memory reaffirmed Coscacuautli's belief that his daily struggle against the elements, the potential flood, the lurking pest, the ceaseless demand for nourishment, was a vital part of the great cosmic struggle between the forces of order and chaos. The Chinampa, this floating, rectangular island of imposed order, was a small model of the cosmos itself, where human diligence ensured that the waters were kept clean and the soil remained fertile, thus appeasing the demanding deities, Tlaloc and Chalchiuhtlicue. To fail in his labor was not merely an economic loss, but a spiritual transgression that risked incurring the wrath of the heavens upon the entire civilization. As the sun fully crested the great temple pyramids, casting long, sharp shadows across the bustling marketplace, Coscacuautli took a moment to sprinkle a small handful of fresh, rich earth, plucked from the heart of his best corn plot, into the canal waters flowing past his feet. This offering was a small but essential tribute to the Water Mother, Chalchiuhtlicue, asking her blessing for the day's trade and her eternal protection against the subtle forces that sought to undermine the dike and reclaim the central basin for the barren salt. He knew that even as he stood among the thousands of people transacting the noisy commerce of the capital, his true home and his sacred responsibility remained out there, far beyond the stone causeways, in the endless, silent, green geometry of the water fields. He heard the loud, insistent call of a high-ranking feather merchant arguing over the price of cacao beans nearby, a sound that quickly drew him back into the immediate reality of the market, where patience and shrewdness were as valuable as the purity of his harvest. He adjusted the position of his finest avocados, making them more prominent, prepared to engage the first serious buyer of the morning, knowing that the transactions of the market were just as essential to the city's survival as the silent, daily renewal of the dark, productive mud. The day's work of selling now began, a different kind of labor than that of the field, demanding the precision of speech where the soil demanded the precision of the hand. The first serious buyer was a steward for one of the Tlatoani's secondary residences, identified by the simple but finely woven mantle he wore and the careful, practiced way he examined the skin of the avocados, searching for any blemish or lack of proper density. He did not haggle immediately, which signaled that he valued quality over mere cheapness, pausing instead to admire the perfect, dark green sheen reflecting the high morning sun, proof that the fruit had been picked at the precise moment decreed by the calendar and the patient earth. Tezcatlipoca spoke quietly of the specific mixture of mud and reeds that fed this particular plot, assuring the steward that this harvest held the very essence of the sweet waters, untainted by the encroaching salt of the eastern marshes, ensuring a superior flavor. The price agreed upon was fair and swiftly paid in shimmering quills filled with gold dust, a testament to the fact that the finest labor of the periphery always commanded the highest respect in the glittering, demanding center. Watching the steward depart with his laden bearer, Tezcatlipoca settled into the deep rhythm of Tlatelolco, an endless, churning river of human endeavor that mirrored the restless currents of the great lake itself, pulling commerce from every corner of the empire. The air vibrated not just with cries of trade, but with the rustle of 10,000 dried maize husks, the metallic clang of copper tools, and the low, collective murmur of a civilization feeding itself through sheer, determined will and meticulous organization. He saw merchants from lands far to the south, their cotton mantles dyed in unfamiliar hues, trading obsidian blades and jade carvings alongside the local women selling clay pots and roasted fish caught that very morning in the shallow reeds. Yet, for all the dazzling variety of the city's wealth, Tezcatlipoca knew that the true, essential foundation of this stone wonder lay in the dark, silent earth he brought here daily, a wealth won not by argument or artistry, but by the relentless lifting and shaping of the heavy, saturated soil. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, scorching the stone paving and warming the deep indigo dyes of his simple loincloth, he noticed a group of city surveyors, men who wore the austere demeanor of architects and engineers, consulting over detailed reed maps near the central causeway entrance. Their conversation was sharp and urgent, centered on the newly expanded southern dike system and the persistent, costly issue of water regulation, a constant battle against both the occasional violent storms and the ceaseless, slow seep of unwanted brine seeking to ruin the sweetwater basins. One of the older engineers, a man whose face was lined like a dried riverbed, gestured sharply toward the far fields where the Chinampas lay, speaking of the enormous amount of tribute labor required this season to reinforce the retaining walls against the anticipated heavy summer rains. Tezcatlipoca felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his stomach, realizing that the city's endless growth and magnificent construction, while necessary, placed ever-increasing demands upon the very farmers whose fragile plots sustained the whole imposing structure. He finished his sails just as the shadow of the great temple began to swing decisively westward, exchanging the last basket of chilies for a bundle of thick, durable maguey fiber ropes he desperately needed for repairing the supporting willow stakes of his own small platform. The noisy commerce, which had energized him earlier, now felt draining and insistent, and the thought of returning to the cool, quiet solitude of the Chinampa plots was a deep, physical longing that pulled at his weary limbs. Carefully counting the total yield, ensuring the proper portion was set aside for the required temple tribute and the market fees, he packed his empty baskets onto his lightweight canoe, securing them with precision and practiced care. He pushed off from the busy loading dock, letting the skilled current of the narrow channel pull him away from the intense clamor of Tenochtitlan's commercial heart. The journey back took him past the organized grids of the closest floating gardens, their disciplined rows of flowers, maize, and beans stretching out like emerald blankets laid upon the surface of the vast, glittering lake. Here, the noise of the city transformed into a soft, distant hum, swallowed by the wide, whispering expanse of water and reed beds, replaced solely by the steady, rhythmic splash of his paddle cutting cleanly through the cool water. He passed other farmers returning late, their boats heavy with goods purchased in the city, new pottery, sharpened stone tools, or bolts of dyed fabric for their families, all moving with the silent, shared understanding of men bound intimately by the demands of water and mud. Tezcatlipoca realized anew that the true, enduring wealth of their civilization was not housed within the high stone walls of the temples, but floated, anchored by ancient wisdom, upon the unpredictable surface of the water. When he finally arrived at his own cluster of 5 long, narrow plots, the evening twilight had begun to paint the sky in hues of orange and deep violet, signaling the comforting shift from the day's heat to the cool, fertile silence of the night air. He pulled the canoe onto the muddy bank of the central path, the heavy, sweet smell of decaying plant matter and wet earth immediately enveloping him, a perfume far richer and truer than any incense burned within the stone walls of the market square. His young son, Icnopiel, no older than 9 cycles of the harvest, immediately rushed out from the small reed hut, eager to help unload the bundles of fiber rope, already bearing the worn, shallow basket used for transferring the life-giving mud. The most essential task of the twilight hour was the Tezcatlipoca, the careful, methodical application of new silt and organic material to the worn surfaces of the plots, ensuring the soil depth remained optimal for the coming weeks of growth and root expansion. Tezcatlipoca showed Icnopal where the rich, black sediment had been dredged from the canal floor the day before, instructing him on how to spread the heavy, cold mud evenly across the surface, stressing the importance of doing so without compacting the tender roots beneath. This was not mere maintenance, it was a sacred partnership with the earth, a daily, tangible act of renewal, where the hands of the farmer actively manufactured and sustained the very ground upon which the entire family stood and prospered. They worked until the moon, a slender crescent, hung high above the peaks of the distant, silent volcanoes, its silver light illuminating the damp sheen of the freshly laid mud, transforming the canals into liquid obsidian mirrors. The cool air settled, bringing with it the croaking chorus of the marsh frogs and the distant, muffled sound of the night drums from the city's center, calling the priests to their late, somber observances. As they ate their simple meal of cooked amaranth and beans, sitting side by side on a thick woven mat, Tezcatlipoca pointed out the patterns of the stars to his son, explaining how their precise, unhurried movements guided the timing of the deep planting and the seasonal cleaning of the vital circulatory canals. He spoke of the great challenge the ancestors faced, turning a hostile, brackish lake into a bountiful garden capable of supporting 100,000 souls, a feat of tireless engineering and relentless faith that was embodied in every handful of dark, productive dirt they spread. He impressed upon Icnopil that the integrity of the floating field was not guaranteed by the strength of the distant Tlatoani or the height of the temples, but by the diligent care shown by their own hands, day after relentless day, in balancing the forces of fresh and salt water. Should they fail in their vigilance, should they neglect the mudding, or allow the reed-reinforced dike to weaken, the salt, the ancient, hungry enemy, would return swiftly and silently to reclaim its barren territory. Later, lying on his reed mat within the small hut, the sounds of the water lapping gently against the supporting willow stakes became a deep, steady lullaby, a constant reminder of the life-giving flow that surrounded and sustained their isolated world. Quetzalcoatl reflected again on the engineers he saw earlier and their complex maps. The city was focused on grand, sprawling projects, new aqueducts, massive temple expansions, and stronger causeways, all necessary manifestations of centralized power and divine favor. But he knew the true, quiet magic resided in the cellular growth of the Chinampa, the daily, tiny miracle where water met earth in perfect engineered harmony, creating necessary sustenance out of seeming nothingness. He thought of the many generations of farmers who had learned the subtle, demanding language of the water, understanding exactly when the lake was calmest for dredging, and precisely which combination of lakeweed, ash, and human waste created the most potent fertilizer. This wisdom was not written in glyphs on towering stone monuments, but etched deeply into the calloused palms of the laborers, passed down through the silent, respectful imitation of father by son. It was a knowledge rooted deep in profound humility, accepting the supremacy of the natural world, while simultaneously demanding its obedience through meticulous, unending, specific work. The next morning, before the dense mist had fully lifted from the water's surface, Quetzalcoatl was already knee-deep in the cool, viscous mud of the northernmost plot, methodically turning the soil with his wooden digging stick in preparation for the coming day's tasks. He was carefully preparing the ground for a special early planting of chilacayote squash, a variety highly prized in the city for its size and flavor, a crop that demanded both perfect drainage and maximum sunlight to ripen correctly. The stiffness of his muscles from yesterday's market trip and the heavy labor of the evening quickly faded, replaced by the familiar, meditative focus required by the rhythmic demands of the turning earth. He worked side by side with his son, teaching him the exact angle required to turn the soil so that it held its vital moisture, but still allowed the sensitive roots to breathe and draw their strength, explaining that impatience in this work was swiftly punished by a meager and disappointing harvest. Suddenly, the stillness was violently broken by the sharp, insistent horn blast from a fast-moving, official canoe approaching down the main channel, its abrupt passage immediately disrupting the gentle ripple of the morning water into angry, slapping waves. The canoe carried 3 men, draped in the blue and white robes of the temple overseers of the lake tribute, their faces set in expressions of cold, official authority that promised only trouble and new demands. These were the men responsible for ensuring that the specified yield quotas were met by every single Chinampa farmer in their vast district, and their unscheduled visits were rarely pleasant, often indicating new, heavier levies imposed by the distant Central City Council. Quetzalcoatl straightened slowly, wiping the dark mud from his hands onto the edge of his simple skirt, his heart settling into a measured, defensive rhythm, knowing that the confrontation over tribute was just as inevitable as the rising of the sun and the flow of the currents. The overseers stopped their craft directly opposite his plots, their haughty expressions conveying the immediate, cold message that his personal efforts and quiet labor were about to be weighed against the expansive, unrelenting, hungry need. The lead overseer, a thin man named Tenochtitlán, known throughout the region for his merciless adherence to the written ledger and his lack of empathy for the toil of the farmer, carried a rolled papyrus tied with a bright red cord, indicating new, urgent directives. He did not bother with the traditional, long-winded greetings of respect, addressing Tenochtitlán with a sharp, high voice that cut across the stillness of the water, immediately demanding to know the status of the winter crop projections for amaranth and beans. Tenochtitlán explained, without softening his tone, that due to a recent unexpected drought in the Eastern Valley, the capital's central grain reserves were lower than usual, necessitating an immediate and sizable increase in the mandated contribution from the lake farmers. Tenochtitlán listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the meticulous, dark rows of his fields, estimating quickly in his mind the immense sacrifice this new, sudden demand would require. It would mean setting aside his high-value plan for the squash and doubling the acreage dedicated to basic, low-profit staples. He explained calmly that while the Chinampas were immensely fertile, their total output was rigidly constrained by the physical size of the plots, and diverting land from one crop to another would fundamentally alter the delicate, careful balance required for sustained yield throughout the rest of the year. The farmer sought to appeal to the overseer's practical knowledge of agriculture, hoping to sway him with the logic and inherent limitations of the soil. Tenochtitlán merely sneered, dismissing the farmer's careful calculations with an impatient wave of his hand, emphasizing that the decree came directly from the Central Kalpuli Council, and the critical needs of the capital superseded the personal plans of any single landholder. He threatened immediate sanctions and the confiscation of tools and future crops if the new quota was not met by the next measuring ceremony, reminding Tenochtitlán with cold eyes that the Chinampas existed only through the grace, protection, and enormous organizational power of the great city's engineers and warriors. The tension between the self-sustaining rhythm of the farm and the relentless, non-negotiable consumption of the metropolis hung heavy and suffocatingly still in the damp morning air. The overseers departed as quickly and noisily as they arrived, their paddle strokes churning the calm water into angry, muddy swirls that lapped aggressively at the fragile, reed-reinforced banks of Tenochtitlan's plots, threatening to erode the fresh mud. He stood silently for a long moment, watching their canoe disappear rapidly toward the northern channel, the silence they left behind feeling heavier and more judgmental than their loud, explicit demands. Icknopil, who had watched the exchange from the bank with wide, worried eyes, looked up at his father, instinctively sensing the gravity and the crushing unfairness of the new burden placed upon their small family and their precious. Tenochtitlan knelt, placing his hands back into the cool, dark earth, seeking comfort and counsel from the substance that never lied or betrayed its master, unlike the distant men of the ledger. He knew that arguing further with the ledgermen was utterly fruitless. Their reality was measured only in rigid numbers and unquestioning obedience, while his was measured in growth, sunlight, and the temperamental moods of the water goddess Chalchut-Lique. There was no appeal, only immediate, decisive action. The meticulous, grinding labor must now become even more precise, more relentless, in order to wring the required surplus from the already burdened and finite soil. He directed Iknapil to fetch the special, reserved basket of finely crushed fish bones and river shells, the most powerful, nutrient-rich fertilizer they possessed, usually reserved only for the most difficult, stubborn plots, and together they began the immediate, painful work of altering the entire planting strategy. The squash seeds were carefully scooped back out of the prepared holes, the promise of easy, high-value trading lost instantly, replaced by the necessity of base survival. The planting sticks now driving deeply into the earth to make room for the demanding, high-yielding maize stalks. This fundamental pivot required not just immense physical effort, but a profound psychological reordering, accepting that their intense labor was ultimately not their own to command, but belonged entirely to the great, stone-girded, hungry mouth of the capital city. As the sun broke fully over the eastern mountains, turning the vast lake surface into a sheet of blinding silver, Coscaquatli worked with a renewed, grim determination, finding a certain meditative freedom in the pure, inescapable necessity of the labor itself. The Chinampa, which had felt like a sacred sanctuary the night before, now felt like a high altar of sacrifice, where the farmer offered not just his yield and his profit, but his entire future to the insatiable deity of the urban center. Yet, even in this sacrifice, there was a quiet, deep pride. The city absolutely needed his specialized mud and his unique skill, and in that undeniable dependence, he found his own deep, unshakable power, the true anchor of his existence. He spent the remainder of the morning ensuring that the water channels running immediately between the plots were meticulously cleared of any blockage, ensuring the perfect free flow that carried life to the roots and cleansed the plot of any accumulating stagnation. He remembered the teachings of his own grandfather, who always said that a neglected channel was a betrayal of the water god, a silent invitation for weakness, rot, and brackish ruin to claim the carefully constructed ground. The precision required for this specific hydrology demanded absolute focus, each movement of the scraping tool exact, ensuring the delicate reed banks were neither undermined nor the vital passage restricted. By midday, the basic structure of the new, accelerated planting plan was established, the fields already showing the subtle, reorganized geometry of necessity, every row now dedicated to the tribute crop. Coscaquatli paused by the edge of the deepest, oldest canal, running his fingers through the cool, flowing water, feeling the powerful, steady current that kept the whole delicate ecosystem functional and resisting the surrounding saline lake. He knew that the only way to meet the excessive demands of the overseers was to not just work harder with tired hands, but to work smarter and more efficiently, integrating the deep ancestral knowledge of soil and water cycles more completely than ever before. He decided immediately that he would need to consult with his closest neighbor, Metzli, an older woman known throughout the region for her encyclopedic knowledge of lake weeds and natural pest deterrents, seeking her counsel on the most efficient, fast-growing maize varieties. Community, he mused, was the secondary dike against hardship, a shared wisdom that stretched back further than the great city itself, a quiet network of mutual obligation rooted deeply in the shared uncertainty of life upon the water. He understood that the city sought to isolate them, demanding individual tribute, but the survival of the gardens lay entirely in their quiet, collective resistance against the rapid erosion of their traditional methods. After the intense heat of the afternoon had finally passed, Quetzalcoatl prepared a small offering, a carefully braided wreath of fresh, golden marigolds and a single, flawless ear of last season's finest maize, to take across the water to Metzli's distinct plot. The sun now sank again toward the west, illuminating the distant stone pyramids of Tenochtitlan, turning the monumental city into a magnificent, silent, golden silhouette against the rapidly darkening sky. The transition from the day's exhausting labor to the evening's quiet pilgrimage carried a weight of profound importance, knowing that the resilience of the future depended not on gold or bureaucracy, but on the practical wisdom shared sincerely between two honest people standing firm upon the unstable ground of the lake. He found Metzli already tending to her evening task, patiently mending a large, complex fishing net by the soft, localized glow of a small rush lamp, her face etched deeply with the history of countless harvests and severe floods. She greeted him without outward surprise, recognizing the look of serious, immediate concern in his eyes, offering him a cool drink of refreshing pulque fermented from the agave plant, inviting him to share his burden by the calm water's edge. The essential conversation began slowly, not with the abrupt statement of the overseer's demands, but with a quiet, mutual assessment of the lake's current water level and the subtle shifts in the wind that predicted the nature and violence of the upcoming seasonal storms. Quetzalcoatl explained the Calpuli's harsh decree, detailing the sudden, seemingly impossible increase in the maize quota, and Metzli listened intently, her fingers never stopping their rhythmic work upon the net, a perfect symbol of her constant, quiet readiness to harvest the uncertain bounty of the lake. She nodded slowly when he finished, confirming that the very same overseers had also visited her, bearing the exact same impossible demands, and that the hunger of the distant city was growing sharper and more rapacious with every passing year. She sighed, a deep, resonant sound drawn from the deep well of long experience, acknowledging that the delicate balance between sustaining the city and sustaining the fragile soil was now dangerously thin and strained to its limit. She offered him not soft pity, but strategic, essential advice, speaking of a rare, fast-maturing type of white maize that required exceptionally careful protection from the diving water birds, but promised an earlier yield that might satisfy the initial harsh demands of the overseers for the first harvest. Metzli also advised him on the precise combination of certain submerged lagoon grasses and ash from the kitchen fire that, when expertly mixed into the heavy mud, could dramatically increase the immediate nutrient absorption, forcing the soil to yield its bounty faster than the traditional methods allowed. This intricate wisdom was a secret currency among the water-bound farmers, shared only when the survival and continuity of the entire collective was gravely threatened. Quetzalcoatl felt a profound wave of gratitude for this shared, critical knowledge, knowing that this small offering of ancient technique was worth more than all the gold quills he had traded in the market earlier that bustling day. He promised to return the favor by lending Ichnopeel's strong young back to the heavy work of dredging her main canal next week, ensuring the integrity and flow of water to her plots in turn, thus reinforcing the unspoken, vital covenant between the neighboring households. The burden of the tribute remained heavily upon him, but it was now a shared weight, supported by the invisible, deep strength of their interwoven community and mutual understanding. He paddled home beneath a vast, star-strewn sky, the water reflecting the myriad lights of the heavens, as if holding the entire universe within its dark, liquid depths, feeling the profound connection between the two. Quetzalcoatl looked toward the massive, glowing city, understanding that while they might live at the very edge of the world's greatest metropolis, their existence was ultimately governed by older, more profound and unyielding laws: the law of the seed, the law of the tide, and the unbreakable, ancient law of mutual reliance. The city might demand the harvest with sharp voices and ledgers, but only the farmer, in patient partnership with the mud, could deliver it. Upon reaching his own patch, he immediately began to prepare the next day's tasks, laying out the wooden tools he would need for the accelerated planting, fueled by Metzli's shared insight and the urgent, unspoken threat of the Kalpuli's decree. The coming work would be utterly exhausting, demanding dawn-to-dusk labor for many unrelenting days, but the knowledge that he possessed the specific, necessary skill to force the earth to yield its reluctant bounty filled him with a quiet, immovable strength. He knew the Chinampas would not fail, not because of the engineers' strong dikes or the Tlatoani's imposing power, but simply because the farmers, bound by the necessity of survival, would not allow them to. He gazed at the silent, organized geometry of his fields, the narrow strips of productive earth, perpetually fed and perpetually tended, seeing them now not just as his livelihood, but as the living, breathing, pulsing heart of his entire civilization, kept alive only by ceaseless, meticulous diligence. The dark mud was the only true ledger, and the tally of their worth was kept not in copper or shining quills, but solely in the green, growing promise of the next necessary harvest.